The screech of car horns filled the air as Zara Williams stepped directly into Seoul's evening rush-hour traffic, her dark eyes blazing with fury that had been building for 3 months. Every step across the busy intersection outside Jinho Industries headquarters carried the weight of her family's destroyed dreams, the echo of her father's broken voice when he told her everything was gone. Wherever you are watching this story unfold, whether you are in a bustling city like Seoul or a quiet town that reminds you of home, I hope you will share in the comments where you are joining us from tonight, because this story of two worlds colliding speaks to anyone who has ever felt like an outsider fighting for what they believe in. Kang Jinho emerged from the sleek glass building at exactly 6:15, just as his assistant had confirmed when Zara cornered her in the coffee shop yesterday. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who controlled billions of dollars with a simple signature, his charcoal suit perfectly tailored to his tall frame. Even from across the street, Zara could see the way other people stepped aside for him, the invisible bubble of power that surrounded Korea's youngest chaebol heir. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her cramped hotel room, practicing the words that would make him understand what he had stolen from her family. The Williams Automotive Parts Company had been more than a business. It was her grandfather's legacy, built from nothing in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood when nobody would hire a black man to do anything but the most dangerous factory work. 3 generations of Williams' blood and sweat had gone into those machines, into every perfectly crafted component that rolled off their production line. Now it belonged to him. Jinho paused at the bottom of the building's marble steps, checking something on his phone with the same casual indifference he had probably shown when signing the acquisition papers. That small gesture ignited something primal in Zara's chest. She pressed forward through the crowd of evening commuters, her voice cutting through the urban symphony of Seoul's financial district like a blade. "You destroyed my family for profit," she shouted, her words carrying across the space between them with startling clarity. "Every job, every hope, every dream we built over 60 years. You bought it all just to strip it for parts." The effect was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Smartphone cameras appeared as if summoned by magic. Zara felt the weight of hundreds of eyes as pedestrians slowed their hurried pace to witness this unexpected drama unfolding in the heart of Korea's business district. She had counted on this attention, had deliberately chosen the most public moment possible to confront the man who seemed to exist behind layers of corporate protection. Jinho looked up from his phone with an expression of genuine surprise that quickly shifted into something more complex. His security team materialized from seemingly nowhere, 2 men in dark suits moving to intercept Zara with professional efficiency. But Jinho raised his hand in a subtle gesture that stopped them in their tracks, his dark eyes never leaving her face. The space between them felt charged with electricity as he took 3 measured steps forward, closing the distance until she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could catch the subtle scent of his expensive cologne mixing with Seoul's evening air. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear, a stark contrast to her public accusation. "Say that again up close," he whispered, and there was something in his tone that made her breath catch. Not anger, not dismissal, but something that sounded almost like recognition, like he had been waiting for someone to finally call him to account. Zara felt her prepared speech dissolve on her tongue as she stared into his face. This close, she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, could sense something beneath his polished exterior that she had not expected. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama, but suddenly the noise of the street faded to background static. "You heard me perfectly well," she managed, though her voice had lost some of its earlier fire. "Your company bought Williams Automotive just to shut us down. 3 generations of my family's work, gone so you could eliminate competition for your Korean suppliers." His expression remained unreadable, but she caught something flickering in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or calculation. She could not tell which, and that uncertainty made her pulse race in a way that had nothing to do with anger. "Miss Williams," he said, and she started at hearing her name from his lips. She had not expected him to know who she was, had assumed she was just another disgruntled former employee to be handled by his legal team. The fact that he recognized her changed something fundamental about this moment. The security guards were growing restless, glancing between their employer and the gathering crowd. Someone in the circle of onlookers was live streaming. She could see the telltale red recording light. This confrontation would be uploaded to social media within minutes. Another viral moment for Seoul's gossip networks to dissect and debate. I think, Jinho continued, still speaking in that low voice that seemed to bypass her anger and speak directly to something deeper, that this conversation deserves more privacy than a Seoul sidewalk can provide. Would you be willing to discuss this matter in my office, where we can speak freely without providing entertainment for the evening news? It was not really a question, and Zara felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. She had come here for a public confrontation, had wanted to embarrass him the way her family had been embarrassed when the plant closure made Detroit's local news. But something in his manner suggested this was not the corporate brush-off she had expected. The crowd was beginning to murmur, phones recording every second of their interaction. She could walk away now, could disappear back into the anonymity of Seoul's millions of residents. Or she could follow this dangerous man into his territory, into the heart of the empire he had built on the ruins of companies like hers. Jinho extended his hand toward the building entrance, a gesture that was somehow both invitation and challenge. Your choice, Miss Williams. But if you truly want answers about what happened to your family's company, I suggest we continue this conversation somewhere we can speak honestly. Zara looked from his outstretched hand to his face, searching for any hint of deception or mockery. What she found instead was an intensity that matched her own, a sense that this man might actually be willing to give her the confrontation she had traveled halfway around the world to demand. The crowd held its collective breath as she made her decision. The phone call came at 3:17 on a Tuesday morning, jerking Zara Williams from the kind of deep sleep that only comes after 18-hour workdays. She fumbled for her cell phone on the nightstand of her cramped Detroit apartment, squinting at the screen through the darkness. Dad. Her father never called at this hour unless something was catastrophically wrong. Zara. Honey, you need to come to the plant right now, Marcus Williams said without preamble, his voice carrying a hollow quality she had never heard before. Bring whatever business documents you have at home. The lawyers are here. The drive from her apartment in Midtown to the Williams Automotive Parts facility in Corktown took 12 minutes in the pre-dawn emptiness, but it felt like hours. Zara's hands gripped the steering wheel of her 10-year-old Honda as she tried to process what lawyers at the plant might mean. Her family's company had been struggling since the automotive industry's latest downturn, but her father had assured her they were managing the debt, that the new Korean contract would save them. The parking lot blazed with fluorescent light spilling from every window of the main building. 3 black sedans sat parked near the entrance like vultures, their occupants clearly visible through the glass. Men in expensive suits who did not belong in a working-class neighborhood at 4 in the morning. Zara found her father in the conference room that had served as the company's nerve center for 30 years. The same room where her grandfather had closed his first major deal, where she had done homework while her parents worked late into the night. Now it felt like a tomb, filled with the scent of fear and fresh coffee that nobody was drinking. Marcus Williams sat at the head of the scratched wooden table, his weathered hands folded over a stack of legal documents that seemed to grow thicker every time Zara looked at them. At 62, he had spent 40 years building Williams Automotive from the small machine shop his father had left him into a mid-sized operation that employed 63 people. Tonight, he looked every one of his years and then some. The lead attorney was a sharp-faced woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Patricia Henderson from Morrison, Keyes and Associates. She spoke in the clipped, efficient tones of someone who delivered bad news for a living, explaining concepts like hostile acquisition and leveraged buyout as if they were discussing the weather. Your father's company has been purchased by Jinho Industries, a subsidiary of the Korean Jinho Group, Henderson explained, sliding a bound document across the table toward Zara. The acquisition was completed yesterday afternoon through a series of purchases of your outstanding debt obligations. Effective immediately, all assets of Williams Automotive Parts are property of the acquiring company. Zara stared at the document without really seeing it, her mind struggling to process words that felt like they belonged in someone else's nightmare. Acquired. Purchased. Debt obligations. The clinical language could not disguise what had actually happened here. What does this mean for our employees? She asked, though some part of her already knew the answer from her father's devastated expression. The facility will be closed within 60 days, Henderson continued. All current contracts will be transferred to Jinho Group's existing suppliers in South Korea. Employees will receive the minimum severance required by Michigan state law. 63 people were about to lose their jobs because some Korean corporation had decided Williams Automotive was worth more dead than alive. Families who had depended on her family's company for decades, people she had grown up with, who had taught her to operate machinery and balance books and treat every customer like the most important person in the world. How is this legal? Zara demanded. You cannot just buy someone's debt and destroy their business. Actually, Henderson replied with the kind of patience reserved for explaining obvious things to slow children. That is exactly how acquisition through debt purchase works. Your father's company owed approximately $4.2 million to various creditors. Jinho Industries purchased those debts at a discount and now owns them outright. Since Williams Automotive cannot satisfy those obligations, they have the right to claim all company assets. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of legal terminology and financial calculations that added up to the destruction of everything 3 generations of Williams' men had built. Zara signed documents she barely understood, her hand moving automatically while her mind reeled with the implications of what was happening. By dawn, it was over. The lawyers packed their briefcases and disappeared into their black sedans, leaving the Williams family alone in the conference room that no longer belonged to them. Marcus sat in silence for a long time, staring at his hands as if they might hold answers to questions he did not know how to ask. Zara spent the following weeks watching her father age years and days as the reality of their situation sank in. The proud man who had taught her that hard work and integrity were the only currencies that mattered struggled to understand how those values had become worthless overnight. Phone calls to banks and lawyers and industry contacts yielded the same response. Nothing illegal had happened. Nothing could be reversed. Williams Automotive Parts was simply gone. The decision to fly to Seoul came after Zara spent 3 sleepless nights researching Jinho Industries and its parent company. What she found was a sprawling conglomerate that specialized in exactly this kind of acquisition, purchasing struggling companies in strategic markets and folding their operations into Korean-based subsidiaries. Williams Automotive was just the latest in a long line of family businesses that had been efficiently dismantled for parts. But unlike the others, Williams Automotive had something Jinho Group needed: specialized manufacturing capabilities for hybrid vehicle components that were becoming increasingly valuable in the automotive market. Instead of destroying those capabilities, they were simply moving them 8,000 miles away where labor costs were lower and environmental regulations were more forgiving. Her father thought she was crazy when she told him she was going to Seoul to demand answers. Her mother pleaded with her to accept what had happened and focus on moving forward. But Zara could not shake the feeling that there was more to this story, that somewhere in the corporate hierarchy of Jinho Industries was a person who had made a choice to destroy her family's livelihood. She wanted to look that person in the eye and make them explain why. The flight from Detroit to Seoul took 14 hours with a layover in Los Angeles. 14 hours for Zara to imagine every possible version of the conversation she intended to have with whoever had signed the papers that ended Williams Automotive. She practiced speeches in 3 languages, researched Korean business customs, and tried to prepare herself for a culture she had never experienced. Nothing could have prepared her for Seoul itself. The city hit her like a physical force from the moment she cleared customs at Incheon International Airport. 15 million people moving with purpose she could not fathom, neon signs advertising products she had never heard of, conversations in a language that sounded like music played too fast. Even the air felt different, thick with humidity and diesel exhaust, and the constant energy of a place that never completely stopped moving. Finding a hotel she could afford took most of her first day. The money she had saved for her father's medical bills and her own graduate school plans now constituted her entire war chest for this mission. She settled on a small business hotel in Myeongdong, a neighborhood that catered to international travelers but still felt authentically Korean enough to remind her constantly that she was very far from home. The challenges began immediately. Simple tasks like ordering food or asking for directions became exercises in frustration and improvisation. Her phone's translation app helped with basic communication, but it could not bridge the cultural gaps that seemed to open wider with every interaction. She was accustomed to being one of the few black faces in Detroit's automotive circles, but Seoul's homogeneous population made her feel visible in ways that were simultaneously fascinating and exhausting. Getting an appointment with anyone at Jinho Industries proved impossible through conventional channels. Receptionists were polite but firm in their explanations that Mr. Kong did not meet with walk-in visitors. His schedule was completely booked for the foreseeable future. Perhaps she could send her inquiry through the appropriate channels and expect a response within 8 to 12 weeks. Zara spent 2 weeks haunting the lobby of Jinho Industries headquarters, arriving early and staying late in hopes of catching Kong Jinho during one of his arrivals or departures. Security guards grew familiar with her presence, their initial curiosity gradually shifting to mild annoyance as she continued to appear every day like a well-dressed protest of one. She learned his schedule through careful observation and conversations with building staff who spoke enough English to understand her questions. Coffee at 8:30 from the shop across the street. Lunch meetings that typically ran long, usually at high-end restaurants in Gangnam. Departure between 6 and 7 in the evening, always through the main entrance, always accompanied by the same 2 security guards. The plan that eventually led to their confrontation formed slowly, born from weeks of frustration and the growing certainty that conventional approaches would never get her the face-to-face meeting she needed. If Kong Jinho would not see her privately, she would create a public moment he could not ignore. She chose the evening rush hour deliberately, when the maximum number of people would witness whatever happened between them. She positioned herself across the street from his building's entrance and waited for the silver sedan that brought him back from his afternoon meetings. When Kong Jinho emerged from the building at exactly 6:15, Zara felt 3 months of anger and desperation crystallize into a single moment of absolute clarity. This was the man who had signed the papers that destroyed her family's legacy. This was her one chance to make him understand the human cost of his corporate efficiency. She stepped into traffic and shouted his name, watching his head turn toward her voice with an expression of surprise that quickly became something else entirely. Something that looked almost like recognition, as if he had been expecting her to appear eventually. As if he had been waiting for someone to finally hold him accountable for the choices he made in climate-controlled boardrooms thousands of miles away from their consequences. The elevator ride to the 40th floor passed in tense silence, broken only by the soft hum of machinery and the occasional chime marking their ascent through the heart of Seoul's financial district. Zara stood perfectly still, hyper-aware of Jinho's presence beside her and the subtle scent of his cologne mixing with the elevator's recycled air. She had imagined this moment countless times during her weeks in Seoul, but reality felt nothing like her rehearsed scenarios. When the doors opened, she followed him down a corridor lined with abstract paintings and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the city sprawling endlessly toward the mountains. His office occupied the corner of the building, a space that somehow managed to feel both imposing and intimate despite its obvious luxury. Traditional Korean pottery sat alongside cutting-edge technology on custom-built shelves. A massive desk dominated one side of the room, its surface so clean it could have been carved from a single piece of black marble. But what caught Zara's attention was the small collection of family photographs arranged near his computer monitor. Images of an elderly woman with kind eyes, a younger version of Jinho standing beside a man who shared his strong jawline and serious expression. "Please, sit wherever you are comfortable," Jinho said, gesturing toward a seating area that included both Western-style chairs and traditional Korean floor cushions arranged around a low wooden table. His formality felt deliberate, as if he was trying to establish some kind of professional distance after their charged encounter on the street. Zara chose one of the chairs, her back straight and hands folded in her lap in a posture her mother had taught her for job interviews and other situations where she needed to project confidence she did not entirely feel. Jinho settled across from her, and she was struck by how different he seemed in this environment. The commanding presence she had witnessed outside was still there, but tempered by something that looked almost like uncertainty. "You have traveled a very long way to shout at me in public," he began, and there was no mockery in his tone. "I think that deserves an honest conversation." Honest would be a refreshing change, Zara replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Your lawyers were very thorough in explaining how my family's business was legally acquired. They were less forthcoming about why it was necessary to destroy 63 jobs to accomplish whatever strategic goal your company was pursuing. Jinho was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. When he finally spoke, his words were not what she had expected. Williams Automotive Parts was 3 weeks away from complete bankruptcy when we purchased your debt obligations, he said simply. Your father had not made a full payment to any of his creditors in 4 months. The bank was preparing to foreclose on your facility. Your employees were going to lose their jobs regardless of what my company chose to do. That is not true, Zara said automatically. But even as the words left her mouth, she felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. Her father had been secretive about the company's finances in recent months, deflecting her questions about cash flow and vendor relationships with vague assurances that everything was under control. Your father is a good man who built something impressive from very little, Jinho continued, his voice gentle but relentless. But he also made some poor decisions about expansion and equipment loans at exactly the wrong time. The hybrid component contract with Hyundai that he was counting on to save the company fell through when they decided to source those parts domestically. How do you know so much about our internal business? Zara demanded, though part of her was beginning to understand with horrible clarity. Because I spent 6 weeks trying to find a way to make the acquisition work without closing your facility, he said. I flew to Detroit twice to meet with your father and tour your operations. I brought in consultants to evaluate whether we could retool your equipment for components we actually need. I explored partnerships with other American manufacturers who might have been able to absorb your workforce. Why? She asked, the single word carrying all of her confusion and suspicion. Jinho stood and walked to the windows overlooking Seoul's glittering expanse, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that reminded Zara oddly of her grandfather when he used to watch the sunrise over the Detroit River. Because 15 years ago, I watched my own father lose everything he had built when larger companies decided his small electronics firm was worth more as a tax write-off than as a going concern, he said without turning around. He spent 30 years building precision components for Samsung and LG, employing 40 people in a small city outside Busan. Then the chaebol decided it was more efficient to bring that work in-house. The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge Zara had not expected him to build. She found herself studying his reflection in the window, noting the way his shoulders carried tension despite his controlled posture. What happened to him? She asked softly. He died 2 years later, Jinho replied. Heart attack, the doctors said, but I knew better. He died because everything he had worked for was gone, and he could not figure out how to matter in a world that had moved past him. When he turned back to face her, Zara saw something in his expression that transformed her understanding of this entire situation. This was not the casual indifference of corporate efficiency she had imagined. This was something much more complex and painful. I am very good at acquiring companies, he continued, returning to his seat across from her. I understand market dynamics and financial leverage and strategic positioning. But I am not good at accepting that sometimes the mathematics of business require destroying the things people love most. So you bought Williams Automotive to save it, Zara said, testing the idea even as she spoke it. I bought Williams Automotive because letting it collapse into bankruptcy would have been worse for everyone involved, he corrected. Your employees would have received no severance. Your father would have faced personal liability for the equipment loans he had guaranteed. The facility would have been sold for scrap metal prices. And instead, she said slowly, you moved our operations to Korea where they could be profitable. Your hybrid component capabilities will be integrated into our Busan facility, where they will employ approximately 200 people and contribute to electric vehicle production throughout Asia, he confirmed. The technology your grandfather pioneered and your father perfected will continue to matter in the global automotive market. But not in Detroit, Zara said, the words tasting bitter. Not in Detroit, he agreed. Which is why I have a proposal for you. Jinho reached for a folder from the side table, the same moment that Zara leaned forward to set her empty water glass down. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same space, a contact that lasted only a second but sent an unexpected shock of awareness through her entire body. She jerked back as if burned, and caught him doing the same. The folder contained documents printed on Jinho Industries' letterhead, official-looking papers that she scanned quickly while trying to ignore the way her hands still tingled from their brief contact. "You are offering me a job," she said, looking up from the contract terms with surprise. "I am offering you the position of Director of International Operations, responsible for overseeing the integration of Williams Automotive's capabilities into our Korean facilities," he replied. "The role would require you to spend significant time in Busan ensuring that your family's manufacturing standards are maintained and that our Korean engineers understand the specific requirements of the American automotive market." "Why would you want me for this position?" she asked. "I have never worked internationally. I do not speak Korean. I have no experience with your corporate culture." "Because you understand what Williams Automotive meant to the people who worked there," he said simply. "Because you care enough about preserving that legacy to fly 8,000 miles to shout at a stranger. Because the technology transfer will only succeed if someone who truly understands the original processes is involved in every step." Zara read through the contract more carefully, noting salary figures that were substantially higher than anything she could hope to earn in Detroit's struggling automotive sector. The position came with housing assistance, language instruction, and a 2-year commitment that could be extended by mutual agreement. "You are asking me to help you complete the destruction of my family's company," she said finally. "I am asking you to help me ensure that your family's contribution to automotive innovation continues to matter in the global market," he countered. "Your grandfather's engineering insights will be built into vehicles sold throughout Asia. Your father's quality control processes will train a new generation of Korean technicians. Williams Automotive will not disappear. It will evolve." The offer was more generous than anything she had hoped for when she boarded the plane in Detroit. It represented financial security and professional opportunities that would have been impossible in Michigan's declining industrial landscape. It also represented a fundamental betrayal of everything she had believed about this situation. "I need time to consider this," she said, carefully placing the contract back on the table between them. "Of course," Jinho replied. "Though I should mention that the Busan facility integration begins in 6 weeks, whether you choose to participate or not. Your family's processes will be transferred with or without your input. The question is whether you want to ensure they are implemented correctly." It was not quite a threat, but it was definitely not a request. Zara found herself caught between admiration for his strategic thinking and frustration at being outmaneuvered yet again. This man had somehow turned her righteous anger into a job interview, her demands for accountability into a discussion of career opportunities. "You have given me a great deal to think about," she said, standing to signal that this meeting had reached its natural conclusion. Jinho rose as well, moving with the same controlled grace she had noticed in the elevator. At this close distance, she could see faint scars along his left hand, evidence of some past injury or accident. It was a small humanizing detail that made it harder to maintain her mental image of him as a corporate villain. "Miss Williams," he said as she moved toward the door, "there is something else you should know about the Williams Automotive acquisition." She turned back, waiting. "The purchase price was significantly higher than the market value of your assets," he admitted. "High enough that your father will be able to pay off all outstanding debts and retain a substantial sum for his retirement." "Why?" she asked, though she thought she was beginning to understand. "Because some things matter more than efficient market transactions," he replied. "Because I remember what it felt like to watch my father's dignity disappear along with his life's work." The elevator ride down felt different than the ascent. Zara stared at her reflection in the polished metal doors and tried to process everything that had changed in the space of an hour. She had come to Seoul seeking an enemy and found something much more complicated instead. A man who had destroyed her family's business to save it, who offered her complicity in that destruction as a path toward preserving what mattered most. When the elevator doors opened onto the marble lobby, Zara stepped out into Seoul's evening rush hour with her entire understanding of the last 3 months fundamentally altered. The contract folder felt heavy in her hands, weighted with possibilities she had never imagined when she boarded that flight in Detroit. She had 48 hours to decide whether to accept Jinho's offer or return to Michigan with nothing but the knowledge that her enemy had turned out to be far more complex than she was prepared to handle. The company apartment in Gangnam was 3 times larger than anything Zara could have afforded on her own, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the Han River and furnishings that looked like they belonged in an architecture magazine. It was also sterile enough to remind her every morning that she was living in a temporary arrangement, dependent on the continued goodwill of a man whose motivations she was only beginning to understand. 2 weeks into her new role as Director of International Operations, Zara had developed a routine that centered around her daily meetings with Jinho. Every morning at 9, she would arrive at his office with technical specifications, progress reports, and the 100 small decisions that came with transferring 60 years of manufacturing knowledge across continents and cultures. What had begun as strictly professional consultations had evolved into something more complex, conversations that ranged far beyond the technical requirements of machinery integration and quality control protocols. She found herself looking forward to these meetings with an anticipation that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with the way Jinho's carefully controlled facade sometimes slipped to reveal glimpses of the man underneath. This morning, he was studying production schedules with the same intensity he brought to everything, his dark hair falling slightly over his forehead in a way that made her want to reach out and brush it back. The thought was so unexpected and inappropriate that Zara felt heat rising in her cheeks as she set her files on his desk. The Busan facility engineers are having trouble understanding your father's calibration process for the hybrid battery housings, Jinho said without looking up from the documents. They can replicate the measurements, but they are missing something essential about the methodology. That is because my father never wrote down the most important parts, Zara replied, settling into the chair across from his desk that had become hers by unspoken agreement. He learned from my grandfather, who believed that some knowledge could only be passed directly from teacher to student. The feel of the metal, the sound the machinery makes when the pressure is exactly right. Those things cannot be captured in specifications. Then we need you in Busan to train them directly, he said, finally looking up to meet her eyes. How soon can you travel? The question should have been simple to answer, but Zara found herself caught by something in his expression. Over the past 2 weeks, she had begun to recognize the subtle signs of whatever complicated emotions Jinho kept carefully hidden behind his professional mask. The slight tightening around his eyes when something frustrated him. The way his hands moved with unconscious precision when he was thinking through a problem. The rare moments when his guard dropped completely, and she caught glimpses of someone who seemed genuinely lonely despite being surrounded by people all day. I can leave tomorrow if necessary, she said. But I think there might be value in having the senior engineers come here first. Let them observe the process in a controlled environment before we try to replicate it in a new facility. Jinho considered this suggestion with the same careful attention he gave everything, but Zara sensed something else in his pause. Relief, maybe, at the prospect of delaying her departure from Seoul. That would require them to stay in Seoul for at least a week, he said. The expense would be considerable. The expense of getting this wrong would be considerably higher, she countered. These battery housing components are going into vehicles that need to function flawlessly for 10 years. If we compromise on the initial setup to save money on training, we will pay for it in warranty claims and reputation damage. He smiled at that, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face and made her realize she had been unconsciously cataloging the small ways his controlled demeanor shifted throughout their conversations. You sound like your father, he said. He told me almost exactly the same thing when I suggested we could save time by having our engineers reverse engineer his processes instead of learning them properly. You met with my father multiple times, she said, filing away this additional evidence that Jinho's involvement in Williams Automotive had been far more personal than she had initially understood. I spent 3 days in Detroit, staying at a hotel downtown and driving to your facility each morning, he replied. Your father showed me every machine, explained every process, introduced me to employees who had worked for your family for 20 years. He was very proud of what he had built. The past tense stung, even though Zara understood it was accurate. Williams Automotive as her father had built it no longer existed, regardless of how its capabilities would be preserved in Korea. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door, followed by the entry of Park Min-jun, Jinho's senior vice president for manufacturing operations. Park was a man in his early 50s who carried himself with the confidence that came from 2 decades of success in Korea's highly competitive electronics industry. He was also someone who had made his disapproval of Zara's position abundantly clear through a series of politely worded but unmistakably hostile interactions. President Kong, Park said with a formal bow that somehow managed to exclude Zara entirely from acknowledgement, I need to discuss the concerns that have been raised about the Detroit project timeline. Zara felt the familiar tension that accompanied Park's presence, the sense that she was being evaluated and found wanting according to criteria she did not fully understand. Over the past 2 weeks, she had learned to recognize the complex hierarchies and unspoken rules that govern interactions within Jinho Industries, but navigating them as an outsider remained a constant challenge. Miss Williams is the project director, Jinho replied evenly. Any concerns about the timeline should be discussed with her directly. Park's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but he turned toward Zara with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Of course, he said in English that was flawless, but somehow felt deliberately formal. Miss Williams, the board has asked me to convey their concern that the integration process is proceeding slower than originally projected. They are wondering if perhaps we have overcomplicated what should be a straightforward technology transfer. The criticism was delivered with perfect politeness, but Zara recognized the challenge inherent in Park's words. He was questioning her competence in front of Jinho while maintaining enough diplomatic language to avoid direct confrontation. The process is proceeding exactly as fast as it should, given that we are transferring manufacturing capabilities that took 60 years to develop, she replied, matching his formal tone. Quality control cannot be rushed without compromising the final product, which I assume is not an outcome the board would find acceptable. Park's smile became even more strained, but before he could respond, Jinho intervened with the kind of quiet authority that reminded Zara exactly how much power he wielded within this organization. Miss Williams has my complete confidence in managing this project timeline, he said. If the board has specific concerns, they can be addressed through the normal reporting channels. I trust that will not be necessary. It was a polite dismissal that Park could not ignore without openly challenging his superior. He bowed formally and left the office, but not before giving Zara a look that promised this conversation was far from over. He does not like me, Zara said once they were alone again. He does not like change, Jinho corrected. And you represent a significant change in how we approach international partnerships. Park has been very successful using traditional methods, and he sees your involvement as an implicit criticism of those methods. Is he right? She asked. Am I a criticism of traditional methods? Jinho was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words carried weight that went beyond their immediate context. You are proof that there are better ways to do business than simply acquiring and absorbing, he said. That sometimes the most valuable thing about a company is not its assets, but its knowledge and culture. Park understands this intellectually, but he has never had to implement it practically. Their afternoon meeting was interrupted by an urgent call from the Detroit facility, where a problem with the equipment transfer had brought production to a complete halt. The machinery that was supposed to be carefully dismantled and shipped to Korea had suffered damage during the removal process, and the local contractors were demanding guidance that only Zara could provide. By 8 in the evening, they were still on conference calls with engineers in 3 different time zones, trying to coordinate a solution that would minimize delays in both the Detroit shutdown and the Busan startup. Jinho had ordered dinner delivered to his office, and they ate Korean barbecue straight from takeout containers while walking through technical diagrams spread across every available surface. Somewhere between the 3rd conference call and the 4th pot of coffee, Zara realized that this was the longest she had ever spent in Jinho's presence without feeling the weight of their formal professional relationship. The crisis had stripped away the carefully maintained boundaries between them, leaving something more natural and collaborative. He had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms that were surprisingly muscular for someone who spent his days in boardrooms. When he leaned over the desk to point out specific details on the engineering drawings, she caught the scent of his cologne mixed with the coffee they had been consuming all evening, a combination that was becoming dangerously familiar. I think we need to accept that the damaged hydraulic system cannot be repaired in Detroit, Jinho said, rubbing his eyes with the kind of exhaustion that made him look younger and more vulnerable. We will have to source replacement components here and delay the Busan integration by 3 weeks. That will cost you a significant amount of money, Zura pointed out. Money that would not have been necessary if the Detroit contractors had been more careful during the removal process. Money is not the primary concern here, he replied, and there was something in his tone that made her look up from the technical specifications she had been reviewing. Their eyes met across the cluttered desk, and Zara felt the same electric awareness that had been building between them for 2 weeks suddenly intensify into something undeniable. The air in the office felt charged with possibilities neither of them had been willing to acknowledge while maintaining their professional facades. Jinho moved around the desk slowly, stopping just close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes and count the individual lashes that framed them. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, carrying an intimacy that made her pulse race. "Zara," he said, and her name sounded different in his mouth than it ever had before. More personal, more weighted with meaning. She stood without conscious decision, bringing them close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the way his breathing had become slightly uneven. The moment stretched between them like a bridge they were both afraid to cross, loaded with implications that would fundamentally change their working relationship and everything that had developed between them. When he reached up to touch her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheekbone with a gentleness that seemed to contradict everything she knew about his controlled, professional demeanor, Zara felt herself leaning into the contact despite every rational reason to step away. His phone rang with the sharp, insistent tone that indicated an urgent international call. The moment shattered like glass, leaving them standing frozen in the sudden return to reality. Jinho's hand dropped to his side as he moved to answer the phone, his professional mask sliding back into place so smoothly that Zara almost convinced herself she had imagined the entire interaction. "President Kong, this is the Busan facility supervisor." The voice from the phone was loud enough for Zara to hear clearly. "We have encountered a serious problem with the foundation preparation for the new equipment installation. We need your immediate authorization for emergency construction modifications." As Jinho discussed technical specifications and budget approvals with engineers 8 hours away, Zara gathered her files and prepared to leave his office. The crisis that had brought them together was far from resolved, but the even larger crisis of whatever was developing between them had just become impossible to ignore. When she reached the door, Jinho covered the phone's microphone and called her name softly. "We will finish this conversation tomorrow," he said, and they both understood he was not referring to production schedules or equipment specifications. Zara nodded once and left his office, stepping into the elevator that would carry her back to her temporary apartment, and a sleepless night spent trying to understand how her mission of professional revenge had somehow transformed into something that felt dangerously close to falling in love with the enemy. The article appeared in Korea Business Daily on a Thursday morning, accompanied by a photograph that had clearly been taken without permission through the windows of Jinho's office. The image showed Zara and Jinho bent over technical drawings, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, their body language suggesting an intimacy that went far beyond professional collaboration. "Foreign influence raises questions about Jinho Industries' leadership," read the headline, followed by 3 columns of speculation about Zara's role in the company and its implications for Korea's automotive industry. The reporter had somehow obtained details about her salary, her housing arrangement, and even the specific terms of the Williams automotive acquisition, information that should have been confidential but was now being dissected by every business analyst in Seoul. Zara read the article while standing in the lobby of Jinho Industries, having picked up a copy from the newsstand across the street on her way to work. The Korean text was beyond her comprehension, but the English summary provided by the building's multilingual staff made the article's implications devastatingly clear. She was being portrayed as everything from a corporate spy to a foreign agent whose real purpose was to steal Korean manufacturing secrets for American competitors. By noon, the story had been picked up by 3 major business websites and was trending on Korean social media platforms with hashtags that needed no translation to convey their hostility. Photographs of Zara entering and leaving the building were being circulated alongside speculation about her qualifications, her background, and her relationship with Jinho that ranged from merely inappropriate to completely fabricated. The harassment began almost immediately. Her company email was flooded with messages ranging from professional skepticism to outright threats. Someone had managed to obtain her personal phone number, leading to calls at all hours from reporters seeking comments and anonymous voices delivering warnings about foreign women who forgot their place in Korean society. Walking to work became an exercise in public scrutiny as people recognized her from the news coverage. Most were simply curious, but enough were openly hostile that Zara found herself planning alternate routes to avoid the clusters of office workers and students who gathered outside Jinho Industries to witness the ongoing drama firsthand. The board meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon, 24 hours after the initial article appeared, and just long enough for the story to gain momentum throughout Seoul's tight-knit business community. Zara was not invited to attend, but she could see the members arriving through her office window. A parade of expensive cars depositing older men in perfectly tailored suits who carried themselves with the authority of people accustomed to being obeyed without question. Park Min-jun appeared in her office doorway at 2:30, wearing an expression that managed to combine sympathy with barely concealed satisfaction. "Miss Williams," he said with a formal bow that felt like mockery, "President Kong has asked me to inform you that your presence will not be required for the remainder of the day. Perhaps it would be best if you worked from your apartment until this situation resolves itself." It was a polite dismissal that felt like exile. Zara gathered her files and personal belongings while Park watched with the patience of someone who had been waiting weeks for exactly this moment. As she prepared to leave, he offered one final comment that confirmed her worst suspicions about his role in recent developments. "It is unfortunate when business relationships become complicated by personal considerations," he said. "Perhaps this will serve as a valuable lesson about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries." The apartment felt like a prison when Zara returned that afternoon, its expensive furnishings and river view suddenly reminding her that she was completely dependent on Jinho's continued support for everything from housing to employment authorization. If he decided to terminate her position, she would have 72 hours to leave Korea with nothing to show for her time in Seoul except a deeper understanding of how naive she had been about corporate politics and international business relationships. She spent the evening pacing between the windows and her laptop, refreshing news websites to track the growing coverage of what reporters were now calling the Jinho Industries foreign influence scandal. Each new article added details that made her role seem more suspicious and Jinho's judgment more questionable. By midnight, at least 6 major business publications had published editorials questioning whether Korea's largest companies were becoming too influenced by foreign consultants and American business practices. The phone call that changed everything came at 7:15 the following morning. Zara was drinking coffee and preparing for another day of exile when she heard Jinho's voice clearly through the thin walls that separated her apartment from the one next door. The conversation was in Korean, but his tone carried a frustration and resignation that needed no translation. She found herself moving closer to the shared wall, pressing her ear against the surface in a way that made her feel guilty even as she strained to understand what was happening. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, punctuated by long pauses during which Jinho seemed to be listening to someone delivering lengthy instructions or ultimatums. When she heard him say her name, clearly and unmistakably, followed by words that sounded like agreement or acquiescence, Zara felt something cold settle in her chest. Whatever was being discussed involved her directly, and Jinho's responses suggested he was accepting terms he did not like but could not refuse. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Zara to convince herself she had misunderstood the entire conversation. Then she heard footsteps moving toward what she knew was the balcony area of the apartment next to hers, followed by the sound of a sliding door opening and closing. She waited exactly 10 minutes before leaving her apartment and taking the elevator to the building's rooftop garden, a communal space that offered privacy and spectacular views of Seoul's skyline. Jinho was standing at the far end of the garden, his hands gripped on the railing as he stared out at the city spread below them. When she approached, he turned toward her with an expression that confirmed her worst fears about the phone conversation she had overheard. "You heard," he said simply. Enough to know that you just agreed to something involving me that you would prefer not to discuss, she replied, stopping just out of arm's reach because she was not sure she could maintain her composure if he tried to touch her. The board has decided that your position with the company creates too much risk for our reputation and our business relationships, he said, his voice carrying the flat, professional tone she had not heard from him in weeks. They have requested your resignation effective immediately. Requested, Zara repeated, testing the word. Or demanded. Jinho's silence was answer enough. And you agreed to this request, she continued, feeling anger building beneath the hurt that threatened to overwhelm her entirely. I agreed to consider their concerns and respond appropriately, he said, but there was something in his expression that did not match the careful neutrality of his words. Which means you are firing me to protect your business interests, she said, stating it as fact rather than question because she needed to hear him admit what was happening between them. Which means I am protecting you from a situation that has become dangerous and professionally destructive for both of us, he replied, and there was enough pain in his voice to make her believe he genuinely thought he was doing the right thing. Protecting me, Zara said, letting disbelief color every syllable. By sending me back to Detroit with nothing to show for 3 months of my life except a deeper understanding of how naive I was to trust you. You are not naive, Jinho said with sudden intensity. You are brilliant and principled, and everything I never expected to find when I started this acquisition. But you are also in danger of being destroyed by forces that have nothing to do with your capabilities and everything to do with people who see your presence here as a threat to their version of how Korea should engage with the world. Those people include you, apparently, she said, backing toward the elevator because she could not stand to be near him while he explained why abandoning her was actually a form of protection. Zara, wait, he called after her, but she was already pressing the elevator button with more force than necessary. The elevator doors opened immediately, as if the universe was conspiring to help her escape before she said something she would regret, or, worse, before she started crying in front of the man who had just chosen his business over whatever had been developing between them. Do not follow me, she said as the doors began to close. Do not call me. Do not send your assistant to explain why this is actually for my own good. Just let me pack my things and disappear quietly so your board can sleep peacefully tonight. The elevator carried her down to her floor in silence, leaving her alone with the realization that she had somehow managed to fall in love with someone who would ultimately choose safety over courage, corporate stability over personal truth. She was pulling her suitcase from the apartment's closet when someone knocked on her door with the kind of insistence that suggested they were not planning to leave quietly. Expecting Jinho, Zara opened the door prepared to deliver the dismissal she had not managed in the elevator. Instead, she found Lee So-young, Jinho's executive assistant, holding a tablet and wearing an expression of barely controlled excitement. Miss Williams, you need to see this, So-young said, pushing past Zara into the apartment with the kind of familiarity that suggested urgent circumstances overruled normal politeness. The tablet displayed what appeared to be a recording application with audio controls and a file dated that morning at the exact time Zara had overheard Jinho's phone conversation. President Kong asked me to record his conversation with the board chairman, So Young explained rapidly. He knew you might overhear and misunderstand what was happening. He was not agreeing to fire you. He was negotiating the terms under which you would remain with the company despite their demands. Zara stared at the tablet as So Young activated the recording, revealing a conversation that was nothing like what she had imagined. Instead of capitulation, she heard Jinho systematically dismantling every argument the board chairman presented, defending her qualifications, her contributions to the company, and the strategic value of the Williams automotive integration. The conversation was a masterclass in corporate negotiation, with Jinho ultimately securing an agreement that protected Zara's position in exchange for accepting additional oversight and agreeing to more conservative timelines for future international partnerships. He is downstairs waiting for you, So Young said after the recording ended. He said to tell you that he chooses you, but only if you choose him back. And he said to remind you that some conversations are too important to finish over the phone. Zara looked from the tablet to her half-packed suitcase to the woman who had just revealed that everything she thought she understood about the morning's events was completely wrong. How long has he been waiting downstairs? She asked. Since you left the rooftop, So Young replied. He said he would wait all day if necessary, but he hoped you would come down soon because he has something important to ask you that requires your answer in person. The elevator ride down felt like falling and flying at the same time, carrying Zara toward a conversation that would determine whether her time in Seoul ended in heartbreak or evolved into something that neither of them had been brave enough to imagine when she first shouted his name across a busy street. Jinho was standing exactly where she had expected him to be, in the marble lobby of their building, wearing the same charcoal suit he had worn to the board meeting, but with his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled in a way that suggested he had been running his hands through it while waiting. When the elevator doors opened and he saw her, the relief that crossed his face was so profound that Zara felt her remaining anger dissolve into something more complex and infinitely more dangerous. "We need to talk," she said, stepping out of the elevator with the caution of someone who had already been hurt once today and was not eager to repeat the experience. "Yes," he replied simply, "but not here." He led her outside into Seoul's early evening bustle, past the news vans that were still parked across the street and the clusters of curious onlookers who had been drawn by the ongoing media attention. Instead of heading toward his usual car, Jinho walked purposefully toward the busy intersection where their story had begun, the same stretch of asphalt where she had shouted his name and demanded accountability for her family's destroyed dreams. When they reached the exact spot where she had confronted him 3 months ago, Jinho stopped and turned to face her with an expression that was entirely different from the controlled surprise he had shown that first evening. This time, he looked like a man who had made a decision that frightened and exhilarated him in equal measure. "You stood here and accused me of destroying your family's legacy," he said, his voice carrying easily over the traffic noise that surrounded them. "You crossed this street in rush-hour traffic because you needed me to understand what my corporate efficiency had cost in human terms." "I remember," Zara said, though she was beginning to wonder where this conversation was leading and why he had chosen such a public setting for whatever he needed to say. "Now I need to cross the street to you," he said, and took 3 steps backward until he was standing in exactly the position he had occupied during their first encounter. The gesture was so unexpected and so perfectly symbolic that Zara felt her breath catch as she understood what he was offering her. A reversal of their original dynamic. A willingness to be the one who took risks for the possibility of connection. When he began walking toward her through the early evening crowd, his eyes never leaving her face, Zara felt like she was watching their entire relationship rewrite itself in real time. This time, he was the one crossing boundaries, the one making himself vulnerable by declaring his intentions in front of witnesses who would undoubtedly record and share whatever happened next. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes and count the ways his carefully controlled facade had cracked to reveal something raw and honest underneath. "That first day, when you shouted at me across this street, I whispered something in Korean that you could not understand," he said, his voice low but clearly audible to anyone who cared to listen. "I said I have been waiting for you, though I did not realize it was true until you appeared in my life like a storm demanding justice." The admission hit her like a physical force, recontextualizing every interaction they had shared since that moment. All the careful professional boundaries, all the gradual revelation of shared experiences and compatible dreams, all the electric tension that had built between them during late-night work sessions and morning coffee meetings suddenly made sense as the courting ritual of 2 people who had recognized something essential in each other but had been too afraid to name it. "This morning, I made a choice," Jinho continued, reaching for her hands with a boldness that drew murmurs from the crowd that was beginning to gather around them. "I told the board that you are not negotiable. That Jinho Industries will find ways to address their concerns about public perception and international partnerships, but we will do it with you as a full partner, not by sacrificing you to corporate convenience." "What does that mean for your position with the company?" she asked, though part of her already understood from the finality in his voice that he had made decisions that could not be easily reversed. "It means I resigned from the board positions that required me to choose between business security and personal truth," he said. "It means I will remain as CEO, but with reduced authority over strategic direction, Because I proved today that I cannot be trusted to prioritize corporate interests over my feelings for a brilliant woman who challenges everything I thought I knew about business and love and what it means to build something worth preserving. The crowd around them had grown larger and more attentive, with smartphones recording every word and gesture of this unexpected public declaration. Zara could see tomorrow's headlines forming in real time, could imagine the social media posts that would turn their private moment into public entertainment. But for the first time since arriving in Seoul, she found that she did not care about the opinions of strangers who would never understand the complicated journey that had brought them to this intersection. "What are you asking me?" she said, though she thought she knew the answer from the way he was looking at her, like she was the solution to problems he had not known he was trying to solve. "I am asking if you will stay in Seoul and help me build something that honors both of our family's legacies," he replied. "I am asking if you will let me love you the way you deserve to be loved, completely and publicly, and without apology for the way we found each other." The kiss happened without conscious decision, a collision of mouths and hearts and futures that had been building since the moment she first shouted his name across this very street. When Jinho pulled her against him with the desperate intensity of someone who had nearly lost what mattered most, Zara felt every barrier she had constructed around her heart dissolve into the Seoul evening air. The crowd around them erupted into applause and camera flashes, but the noise felt distant and unimportant compared to the way Jinho whispered her name against her lips like a prayer he had finally learned to speak aloud. 6 months later, Zara stood in the conference room of Williams Automotive's new American headquarters, watching a live video feed from the Busan facility where Korean engineers were training the latest group of Detroit technicians in hybrid battery housing assembly. The integration that had begun as a corporate acquisition had evolved into something unprecedented in international manufacturing, a genuine partnership that preserved the best elements of both companies while creating capabilities neither could have achieved alone. The Williams Automotive name had been restored to the American operations, with Jinho insisting that her family's legacy deserved recognition rather than absorption into corporate anonymity. The Detroit facility had reopened with 40 of its original employees, supplemented by Korean engineers who rotated through 6-month training programs that strengthened both operations. Zara's title was now president of Williams Automotive International, a position that required her to split time between Seoul and Detroit while overseeing the expansion of their partnership into electric vehicle components for the global automotive market. It was demanding work that pushed her capabilities in ways she had never imagined, but it was also the fulfillment of dreams her grandfather could never have envisioned when he started his small machine shop in Corktown. The office door opened behind her, and she turned to find Jinho carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of smile that still made her pulse accelerate even after 6 months of waking up beside him every morning. "The wedding planning meeting with your mother is in an hour," he reminded her, setting her coffee on the desk beside the technical drawings she had been reviewing. "She wants to discuss whether Korean traditional music will work with gospel hymns, and I am not sure either of us is qualified to have that conversation." "My mother has very strong opinions about music," Zara replied, accepting the coffee gratefully while trying not to think about the complexity of blending 2 families, 2 cultures, and 2 very different ideas about appropriate wedding celebrations. "As does mine," Jinho said with the rueful expression of someone who had spent considerable time mediating between Korean tradition and American practicality. "I suggested we let them work it out together and focus on writing our vows in both languages." The idea of standing in front of both families and declaring their love in Korean and English felt simultaneously terrifying and perfect, a public acknowledgement of how much they had both changed since that first confrontation outside his office building. "Speaking of declarations," Zara said, moving closer to him with the unconscious magnetism that had never faded despite their daily proximity, "I have been thinking about what to say about us when the business magazines ask for our success story." "And what conclusions have you reached?" he asked, setting his own coffee aside to give her his complete attention in the way that had become one of her favorite things about loving him. "I think we should tell them that sometimes the most important business partnerships begin with someone being brave enough to shout the truth across a busy street," she said, standing close enough to see herself reflected in his dark eyes. "That the best negotiations happen when both parties are willing to admit they need what the other person offers." As Jinho leaned down to kiss her with the same intensity he had shown on that soul intersection 6 months ago, Zara reflected on how completely her life had been transformed by the decision to demand answers from a stranger who turned out to hold the key to everything she had never known she was looking for. If this story of love crossing cultural boundaries and finding strength in unexpected partnerships has resonated with you, I would love to hear in the comments about your own experiences with taking risks for love, or how cross-cultural relationships have shaped your understanding of what it means to build something beautiful with someone from a completely different background. Because these connections that bridge worlds remind us that the most meaningful relationships often begin with the courage to speak truth across whatever distances separate us.